everyone. My name is John Bristowe. Welcome to the Octopus 101 webinar series. I'm the community director here at Octopus Deploy. I'm really glad that you could join us here today. Now, before I begin, I just want to quickly share why we host these webinars. At Octopus, we're all about helping teams be successful with DevOps and deployment automation, and Octopus 101 is a monthly webinar that we run to give new users a solid starting point with the product. Allows you to see Octopus in action, allows you to kick the tires, get a sense of what Octopus is all about, and understand the who, what, where, when, and why around Octopus. So we host these across 3 specific regions, the Americas, APAC, and right here in EMEA. So for folks in Europe, welcome. And we use this as an ability to connect with you in your local time zone. This allows us to make it easy for you to ask questions, learn, and engage with us. So whether you're starting out with Octopus for the first time or you're looking to bring it into your team's workflow, this session is for you. What we're going to do is we're going to cover the fundamentals of what Octopus is, how it works, and how it fits into your CI/CD pipeline. We'll explore a bunch of key concepts. We'll look at things like projects. We'll take a look at environments. We'll talk a little bit about deployment targets and deployment processes. We'll talk about a feature called Runbooks, which is really cool. And of course, I'll walk you through a live demo so you can see all of this in action. Now, before we get started, a few housekeeping items. This session is being live streamed across all our social media channels. So whether you're joining us from LinkedIn, YouTube, X, or Facebook, welcome. We're thrilled to have you. But the recording for this will be available up on our YouTube channel. So you will be able, I'll point you to this in just a second. But if you miss anything during today's webinar, don't worry, you'll be able to watch this back up on our YouTube channel. You can also share it with your team. So there you go. And since we're live, please don't be shy. Please feel free to ask any questions you may have as we go. Pop them into the chat or the Q&A pane. I'll do my best to answer them live and along the way. And what we'll do is we'll reserve some time at the end to do any other additional live Q&A you may have. Now, before we jump into the demo, let's take a question to answer let's take a second to answer the big question here, which is, what is Octopus Deploy? To discuss that, we have to describe a little bit about our pipelines. So Octopus Deploy is a deployment automation tool. It's a platform built for modern software teams. It sits at really the heart of your software delivery pipeline. It allows you to take your code that's been built and tested and move it safely and reliably through your environments from development and staging all the way to production. It's designed to take the complexity and manual work out of deployments, which is a really, really gnarly thing that you have to deal with all the time, especially as a developer. We see a lot of this in sort of DIY sort of deployments. So with Octopus, you can define your deployment process once, and you can use steps that are easy to follow and repeatable, and then reuse that process over and over again across all your environments. And that means that you get fewer errors, you get less stress, and ultimately it's a faster path for delivering value to your users. Now, Octopus supports a wide range of deployment targets, Kubernetes, Azure, AWS, etc. But the reason why, and this is really important, understanding the reasons why you might want to consider a technology like Octopus is because when doing this on your own through DIY, etc. deployments, things can get really tough. You have to write a lot of custom scripting, a lot of custom code to actually support this. And so one of the challenges that we're trying to address is to make this a safe and sane environment. So by taking that extension, you can see how Octopus really kind of solves a lot of the challenges that we have. We have features like environment progression. We have the ability to support deployment strategies, etc. We have built-in DORA metrics. We have powerful features like runbooks, as I mentioned earlier. We have features like tenants. We have config as code, which allows you to basically define your deployment processes and put them into Git. We have a rich UI. We have a lot of stuff, and it's really, really a powerful platform worth looking at. And so ultimately, when looking at this, you can ask the question, so why should I use it? It's because deployment shouldn't be your bottleneck. Octopus helps you ship faster and more confidently. So looking at this example here, in a practical sense, you can look at this in the context of something like GitHub, for example. So GitHub is a very common sort of scenario that a lot of folks like to target. A lot of code is hosted in GitHub. And with GitHub, we support the ability to integrate on a deployment aspect through 3 key ways. The first one is through a set of GitHub actions that we have, and I'll show you some of those in action. We also have an extension available for GitHub Copilot, so you can actually talk to Octopus via AI and chat with your deployment tool of choice, that is Octopus, through Copilot. We also have a GitHub app as well. So there's lots of ways in which these tools can integrate. And my intention throughout all this is to demonstrate and show you how that all works. So with that being said, let's not waste any time and let's get straight into the fun part, which is a demo. So I'm going to switch over to my Chrome instance here. Now, just to reiterate, if you want, you can check out a free trial by visiting our website, which is at octopus.com. There you can download and install a version of Octopus on your own infrastructure if you wish, or you can sign up for a free cloud instance for a trial and kick the tires that way. We also have a bunch of instances online that you can check out as well. So again, that's at octopus.com. I mentioned earlier the fact that we'll be recording this. It's going to be available up on our YouTube channel. You'll find it by searching for Octopus Deploy. You'll be able to find it there. All right, let's jump into a demo. This is the Octopus dashboard. So let me explain some things here. So there's going to be a bunch of concepts I'm going to throw your way, but that's okay. We'll get through this pretty quickly, and then you'll understand the motivations as to why Octopus should be considered as part of your CI/CD pipeline. So inside of my dashboard, the dashboard itself gives me a single pane of glass. It's that sort of one place that I need to go to figure out how are my deployments doing across all my pipelines, my environments, my projects, my applications, etc. So inside of this dashboard, you can see on the left-hand side, I have a list of projects. So these projects can be named anything you want. Along the top, I have my environments. So these are ones that are predefined, but you can list these any way you wish. So I have environments like development, environments like staging, for example. And notice that I have different versions of these projects deployed to these environments. In fact, just to make this a little bit easier to show, let me get rid of my talking head here so you can see the full screen. All right, so you can see here I have a bunch of projects and I have a bunch of environments that I'm deploying across to. Let's take a look at one of these projects and let's specifically drill into how we define what we like to call a deployment process. So a deployment process is really at the heart of how Octopus Deploy really works. So Octopus defines a series or a collection of these steps, and these steps define actions that you'll run against for any number of things to define a deployment. So if we jump over to this tab here that says process, this is where we define our deployment process. This is really the heart of Octopus itself. So as I said before, a deployment process is the series of steps that we execute to do a deployment. So think of any type of deployment you may do in your environment today. So I may run a series of scripts. I may want to target those scripts to, say, issue commands to a variety of deployment targets. Maybe I want to take files, put them in certain locations. Maybe I want to upgrade a database, etc. Whatever those steps may be, the way that you define your deployment process is by piecing these things together. And we provide a sort of WYSIWYG environment for you to do this. Now, it should be noted that you can actually define this in code. We have the ability of persisting this to Git, and you can edit these using a text file. But for this example here, which is like an Octopus 101 Hello World example, we're going to utilize the designer. So let's go ahead and modify my deployment process. So out of the box, we support a variety of deployment process steps. So these steps are kind of like atomic units of work. So you can think of these steps as like the building blocks, the recipe that goes into making the cake, which is your deployment process. So we have a variety of steps that are defined here, which are featured for things like Helm chart execution. If I want to run customize against my Kubernetes cluster, for example. Incidentally, the one that most folks run is this one called run a script, excuse me. So run a script is basically give me control of the car I want to drive myself. It allows you to define these in a variety of shell languages and allows you to do a bunch of things there. But we do have specific ones for things like Docker, for Terraform, if you're doing anything that's targeting AWS, for example, or Azure. You can see, you get a sense of kind of like all the steps that are here. There's a whole bunch of steps that we include out of the box with Octopus that allow to basically comprise or compose these deployment processes. I can work with packages directly. A package is like a tarball, a jar file, a zip archive, a NuGet package, whatever it is that you use as your deployment element. That is the file or files for your deployment. That is what we define as a package. And we have a built-in package repository. You can use external package repositories, up to you. If there is a step that we don't support out of the box, there's over 500 community steps that have been added and integrated within our library. So if there's a scenario that you can envision that you want to integrate with from a deployment process perspective, chances are it's been covered as part of this. We have steps in here for Teams, we have steps in here for Slack, for Kubernetes, for Firebase, for Docker, a whole bunch of other technologies that you may want to integrate with, and these are known as community steps. Okay, let's take a look at a deployment process itself. So the deployment process that I'm working with is defined here in this well here. So you can see my first step here is called run a script. It's the run a script step that I showed you earlier. Now, when you define a deployment process in this series of steps, these steps are going to have a bunch of settings associated with them. Don't worry about what you see here too much. Just know that you can control not only the way that these steps execute, the retry policies, for example, around them, but also the very specific things around the step itself. So in this example here, my first step is to run a custom script. Now, because of that, I want to define potentially what that script does. So I can define the script code as either inline, or I can actually get that source from a different location. So out of the box, we support the ability to load your script from one of three sources, either inline as part of a Git repository, or it can be embedded in a package. We'll actually crack open the package and utilize the script that's embedded within that, if it's a zip archive, for example, and we'll utilize that as part of this step execution. So once I've defined this here and set up everything and ready to go, there's a variety of other conditions that I can define. Most steps have these conditions associated as a deployment process, so I can define where this step will execute. And I'll talk a little bit about why that's important in just a second. But these steps can run in specific conditions, like whether the previous step failed or succeeded, what environments they want to run in, whether or not I want to execute a retry as part of this execution. You might wonder, like, why would I want to retry a step? Well, sometimes you have to communicate to external services. And oftentimes, between Octopus that's running and that external service, there's a network involved, and there might be latency. So your network may not be as reliable as you might like. And if you're doing long-running sort of deployments that require large uploads, for example, you may want to invoke some retries as part of that until the upload succeeds, or, for example, there's a successful communication if the network is flaky. So these and other sorts of scenarios we try and think about when defining your deployment process. And as I said before, these are the building blocks for defining these as part of Octopus. Now, I am aware of the fact that obviously people will define these in a bunch of different ways. So just know that this is sort of like a hello world type example. Now, let's take this and create what we call a release. A release is essentially a snapshot of the deployment. So all the things that go into defining your deployment, all the packages, all the variables that may go into a deployment. So we have a very rich and variable subsystem built into Octopus as well. All that stuff gets baked into a release, and that is essentially a snapshot. It persists all those values. Now, we can define a version inline here. We can also auto increment that if we wish. Let's go ahead and assume the defaults and click on save. And now here's my snapshot that persists all of the values, all the environments that I wish to target, any packages that may be associated with this. Now, because this is sort of a hello world example, there's nothing associated with this, but in more elaborate scenarios, certainly these things would be populated. So now what we can do is we can now deploy this to development, one of the many environments I have defined as part of this instance. So development is one of many environments that I have defined. You can define these in a variety of locations, and these are semantically to your environments themselves. They are just semantically meaningful terms. They are terms that you define to physical environments, or physical targets rather. I can specify a schedule for this. I can define them whether I want it to have high priority. I can give it a bunch of other things as well. I can also elect after the fact to choose, I want certain steps to not be run. And you may wonder, why would I want this? Well, there may be sort of emergency tasks you may want to run, or this is a specific case. I can turn off certain steps as part of this if I wish. Let's go ahead and now deploy this. Now, this is, again, a hello world example. But the reason why I'm showing this is because I want to also highlight the rich auditing and compliance sort of work that we've done inside of Octopus. So oftentimes, a lot of folks want a system of deployment that allows you to ask the question of when did the deployment go out, who did the deployment, etc., what actually was deployed, etc. And so everything that we do from a deployment perspective is logged. You can turn on the verbosity associated with this. You get a rich task log associated as part of this execution. You can turn on and off timestamps and categories, for example. You can also get a sense of the task itself just from a high level perspective. These are the sort of check marks that you saw earlier. Now, if we had a deployment that didn't succeed, you'd see a big red X. But as it's executing here, you get these logs persisted. I can also output these logs to external services like Splunk or Sumo, for example, if I wanted to. We really give you that ability to utilize the tools that make you happy. In addition, I can also get a rich history of the release itself. If I promote this release to, say, staging, for example, I'll see that listed here. All of this is audited as part of our subsystem. There's additional information that you can also propagate as part of release. This is called build information. These are all the commits that you do through pull requests and other sort of things in your backend repository. So any commits or work items that you close off that you can integrate with this, you can expose via build information. The reason why that's important is you can actually build a lot of interesting artifacts off of that. So we allow you to persist those values as part of this release. So once that's done, it actually propagates inside of a timeline. You can see here we have our deployment queue. And the reason for that is because we're pushing this out as a schedule, for example, and now it's been successful. But you get a sense of this timeline occurring here. So that is a very simple example. If we switch over to another instance here, and yes, I should denote, sorry for the context switch here. I wanted to demonstrate here that we have light and dark mode. So avert your eyes. Sorry for that. Hope your retinas weren't too hurt by that. So this is another example of what some more elaborate project situations might look like. It should be noted that we just turned on a new feature called Kubernetes Live Object Status. I'll mention that in a second here. But just to kind of highlight what this might look like from a more elaborate example here, if we jump into one of these projects here and take a look at its deployment process, you can see that deployment processes can be very simple from this perspective. So here I'm just executing a script that's targeting a Kubernetes cluster and then deploying via customize. We can do everything like that, or we can go to more elaborate examples, like jumping back here into this project here. And I can take a look at a variety of ways in which I can integrate with other deployment targets. So for example, if I want to integrate with SQL and IIS, a sort of traditional target, and take a look at the deployment process associated with this, you can see that we actually can get some very elaborate scenarios here. It's not uncommon when we engage with customers to see them actually have tens of steps associated with their deployment process. Now, some things to worth note here. So deployment processes can execute, as I said, as a series of steps. Those steps can execute either in parallel or as child steps. So in this example here, you can see we actually have a series of steps that are executed as part of this deployment in series and in parallel. And these can actually execute as child steps if you have a previous successful step that's been executed. In addition to that, we also have Markdown that's integrated as part of this. The reason why that's important is because obviously if you have more than one team or you have a range of folks using Octopus for your deployment tool, Markdown allows you to get a better description of what these steps actually do. Now, something that's worth noting here is that I mentioned this earlier, that you can actually target steps for individual environments. So this is an environment tag that says this step will only run in production. And that is really useful in certain scenarios. Like, for example, in this scenario here, this is a step called a manual intervention. A manual intervention is basically like, go get a human to say, yes, this is okay to do a deployment. So a human must approve this production release in order for it to continue. And this will only occur in a production release itself. And that kind of makes sense. You don't want to go around approving releases to staging or development. But in production, where it's very important, that may be something you want to do. And so these and other types of steps we have available, and you can utilize these as part of a deployment process. Excellent. All right, let's jump back to my slides. All right, so that was a very high level, very sort of hello world of Octopus itself. I threw a lot on the table. I realize that we talked a lot about terms, but as we go through the demos a little bit more, I'm hoping that this will become easier to understand, and then eventually you'll be like, oh, I get this. This is not really that hard. All right, so just to summarize some of the things that I showed you, I mentioned the fact that we have a deployment process represented as a visual representation. So we provide this visual representation of a deployment process. These include conditions. You saw environments being exposed. We also have things like integration with tenants, which is another capability I'll talk about. We have the ability of supporting child steps. We have a whole range of conditions as well that you can denote on steps. You can do retries, etc. So these and other sorts of things you can do as part of a deployment process. I mentioned earlier the fact that we have integrated Markdown. This is very, very helpful in team scenarios. I mentioned the fact that we have also parallel step execution if you want two steps to run at the same time. And we also have environment labels. So this is kind of the crux or the fundamental concept of how Octopus is thought of from a deployment perspective. Now, there's a bunch of other things that we have to mention, like, for example, the ability to do rollbacks. So oftentimes when you do a deployment, sometimes things can go wrong. It happens. Even if you're using a tool like Octopus, sometimes deployments can fail for a variety of reasons. Maybe you set up a config incorrectly. Maybe there's something wrong with the code that's been built. There's a bug. You want to be able to do a rollback very quickly as part of that process. Octopus provides that facility. It's a very easy process to do, to roll back, and it's deeply integrated within Octopus. The idea is you just simply roll back to the previous version of that snapshot of release that you have propagated, and things are just stood up in that manner. So the intention here is to provide you really with a reliable and risk-free environment for you to do your deployments. We want you to deploy every day of the week. Yes, even deploy on Friday and Saturday and Sunday. You should be able to do continuous delivery all the time. And your deployment process shouldn't be a barrier for you to do these things. You should be able to safely and sanely do deployments. That's the idea. That's why you use a tool like Octopus, so that you can do these in a safe and sane manner. In addition to that, there is also the other side of the DevOps coin. Oftentimes when people talk about DevOps or DevSecOps, they only talk about the dev part of it. They don't talk about the ops or the sec. So in the case of DevOps, the ops part, there are a lot of tools out there that allow you to do operations management, but few you'll find that actually marry the two, that to have a true perspective of DevOps. So we have a facility in Octopus called Runbooks, which basically allows you to do those operations in hand or side by side with your deployments. So as part of this, we allow you to define runbooks that will define any number of routine or emergency operations that you want to perform against your infrastructure. So common scenarios might be, hey, someone needs to restart the web server for whatever reason. It's a scenario we have at work, for example. Or we have to apply Windows updates or update the database schema. These and other sorts of operations that you have to consistently run can be defined as a runbook, very similar to the way in which you define a deployment process. And you can set it up with the necessary permissions, control those through RBAC, role-based access control. You can control those permissions and give them or grant them to only specific users of your team, and then have these sort of automations run when necessary or in concert with deployments. So Runbooks gives you a really, really powerful around the operations management side of it. In addition to that, we also have integration with, of course, YAML and being able to integrate with Kubernetes in a very rich way. So we expose this quite throughout the product itself. We actually have a Helm chart that allows you to do deployment of Octopus to a Kubernetes cluster if you're so inclined. And a really important feature worth mentioning is multi-tenancy. This is a feature that a lot of customers, when they've used the product for a while, really get to use a lot and love. Multi-tenancy is the one feature that most customers cite when asked, what is your favorite feature of Octopus? And so multi-tenancy is this ability to basically define tenants that define your different deployment scenarios for a particular application. So common scenarios might be things like, I want to deploy this to different clinics. Maybe I'm running a health department of a certain region, and those clinics, based on their geography, will have different versions of the application. So we can define as tenants, and we can propagate application versions to different types of tenants across my various locations. So multi-tenancy and being able to deploy across 10,000s of these types of endpoints is really, really nice. And you can do this all without duplicating your deployment process. So the idea is you have one deployment process and you can utilize that across all your tenants, which is great. And of course, I mentioned this earlier around auditing. This is something that we really, really care a lot about, risk, governance, and compliance. So I showed you the audit log earlier. We can export that to a variety of third parties. We can also integrate with additional third parties in the form of governance through like Jira Service Management or ServiceNow as 2 examples. So you can actually have one act as the arbiter for the other, for example. So you can have ServiceNow, its integration with DevOps. You can actually have it issue change requests when those are approved to issue deployment commands to Octopus. So you can actually have ServiceNow as the arbiter for deployments being run by Octopus. So that integration flows throughout the pipeline, and it's a really, really nice feature and a lot of customers use. All right, so I'm back to a demo. That's enough slides. I don't have a lot of slides, but there you go. Excuse me. Just take a break for water. My kids are in school, and as everyone knows, or people who have kids, when they come home, they bring everything with them. So there you go. Apologies for that. So we're going to jump into another demo now. Now, this scenario, I want to describe or kind of lay out some of the ways in which you can automate your deployments. So right now, everything as I've been showing you is through the UI. So click, 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 and away you go. But as we all know, when utilizing automation, a lot of this stuff kind of happens in the background. It's triggered through, for example, a build or a CI process. How do we kick those things off, or what's the integration story there with Octopus? All right, so let's jump back into my browser, and let's go ahead and move over to GitHub. So this is a sort of stock variety type repo I have up on GitHub. It's actually one of our examples here called Octopus. We have a bunch of these, but you can imagine, if you will, this is your repo. Now, what we're going to show you here is integration with GitHub Actions. So GitHub Actions are basically the workflows that execute as part of GitHub. So when you do a build, or when you want to commit a build, or you you want to do something based on pull request, for example, you'll define these as part of GitHub Actions. And these are defined as part of a sub execution here called workflows. So GitHub Actions allow you to perform a variety of operations, and these are integration points with GitHub. But if we take a look at one of these examples here, I don't know, let's take a look at this one here where we have front-end integration. This is a YAML file that defines the way in which we'll define our workflow. So there's a variety of ways in which I can run these actions. And you can see, if we take a look at other YAML files here, you can see that they're just YAML files that define a series of steps that I want to execute as part of this build. So these can be kicked off in a variety of ways. The common one here, which is workflow dispatch, what this basically says, it allows you to execute these through a button. But they can be executed in a variety of ways. So whether you have a push command that's been executed on a particular branch, or you've done other operations within your repo, these and other sorts of executions will basically trigger these actions to run. Now, if I wanted to, I could integrate this through an automation process. And the automation process itself will allow me to utilize these GitHub Actions in a very rich way. If I wanted to take a look at, for example, the GitHub Marketplace, if you do a search here in the GitHub Marketplace, this is the repository of all the GitHub Actions that third parties, for example, have made. We have a number of actions that you can utilize as part of that YAML description. So if you search for Octopus, you'll see we have a bunch of actions here that allow you to do things like run a runbook, push a package up to our repository, being able to create a NuGet package for Octopus deployment, deploy a release. These and other sorts of operations you can do. You'll also find there our GitHub app, and you'll also find our integration with GitHub Copilot, but that's beyond the scope of what we're discussing here. If I wanted to run a runbook, let's say I want to execute one of those operations that I've defined, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. I can utilize this action here. Utilizing this in the context of a YAML file is very simple. You simply define it accordingly, and you give it the necessary parameters you want to run. So we ask questions like, what project is the runbook located? What is the name of the runbook? And are there any environments that you want to control for when running this runbook? This is how you run a runbook in Octopus from GitHub. You issue this command via the action. If I wanted to deploy a release, for example, so let's say I wanted to deploy a release in Octopus deploy, for example, this is how it might look. So I utilize this action here inside of my YAML file, give it a necessary parameters here for integrating with Octopus, and this will execute that deployment of that release within Octopus. So these are the ways in which we integrate with Octopus via GitHub through GitHub Actions. But we have other integration points as well. So if you're a fan of Azure DevOps, here I'm utilizing Azure Pipelines, and you can see the integration that we have here. This is the integration through the old UI. We're not looking at the YAML here. We're just looking at the old UI for Azure Pipelines. But they look almost identical to GitHub Actions when you use them in Azure DevOps. So I can create releases, I can deploy releases, I can promote projects, etc. These and other types of operations we have exposed through Azure DevOps. We are the #1 integration for TeamCity. So if you go to the JetBrains Marketplace, you'll find the Octopus deploy integration listed there. We push to this all the time. We integrate with Jenkins as well. So you'll find this up on the Jenkins plugins repository. So these and other, there's a bunch of other CI processes and services we integrate with as well. Chances are we integrate with all of them. And if there is one that we don't, you should let us know. But this is a way in which you'll start or begin the process of conducting an automation. So typically automations that are pipeline specific will be triggered by a pull request that then flows through your source repository, runs a bunch of commands, and then ultimately you want to go about doing a deployment. This is how you integrate Octopus as part of that pipeline. So you wire these things together and you make them part of your pipeline for that automation. So I mentioned obviously GitHub integration, which is extremely popular, but GitLab is another common scenario that people tend to use. These and other types of integrations you'll find up on our integrations page. So if you go to octopus.com/integrations, you'll see a page that looks like this. Again, we support dark and light mode. But you'll see that we have a bunch of featured integrations here. We have all our community steps that I mentioned earlier. But these integrations can be found here, and you can explore how we integrate with other technologies, utilizing those technologies in conjunction with Octopus. All right, so let's jump back into Octopus itself. I mentioned a bunch of things that I wanted to show you, like things like runbooks, etc. So let's take a look at an example here. We'll jump into this project here. It's just canonical sort of project called Octopus. Where do runbooks live? They live in this section here called runbooks. So along the left-hand side here, you can see this is what my menu structure looks like. More often than not, you'll sit in this, which is defining your deployment process. You'll define other things as well, things like what we call channels and triggers. Those are different concepts. Just short, you can define channels, which are ways in which you can define deployment channels for your deployments. You can also set up triggers when a deployment will actually run. You can have those scheduled as well. But here, under the operations section, we have the ability of doing the creation of runbooks. And runbooks are very similar to deployment processes in the sense that they allow you to define these operations in a series of steps. So here we can define our runbook process, and I'll add a step to my runbook process. And it's a similar sort of mechanism that you would expect in a deployment process, except in this context, we're doing it as an ops mechanism. So here we're thinking about runbooks, we're thinking about operations, either routine or emergency based. And the process of constructing these is largely similar to constructing a deployment process. In this case here, we have the ability of doing these runbook executions directly through the runbook integration here. So you can see I have a bunch of runbooks that have been defined. So for example, I can configure a SQL server, or I can do Azure Web App provisioning, for example. And simply by clicking on the run here, I can define what environments I want this runbook to execute against. And then I can define a bunch of other parameters as well. We define a snapshot because we're not doing a release here. We're running a runbook. We actually infer a snapshot as part of that. But a snapshot is basically a point in time that we define for you for this runbook run, or sorry, for the execution of this runbook. There's other things that we can do as well. There's lots of knobs and switches associated with runbooks as well. I can define also what environments that the deployment targets will be associated with this as well. So lots of stuff to show there. Let's jump back into the dashboard and talk a little bit about deployment targets. So deployment targets are ultimately the physical, I guess, virtual locations that you want to do your deployments to. So out of the box, you can obviously deploy to a variety of locations, Kubernetes clusters through either the agent or API. Of course, we recommend the agent. We have the ability of installing software that allows you to integrate with Linux, Windows, Mac, Azure, AWS, etc., etc. You'll notice this terminology here called tentacle. That's just basically a name that we use to describe an agent. So through tentacle, it's like an agent. If you've used agent software before, it allows you to basically run commands on a remote machine. So this is really useful because the tentacle will allow you to do, through a secure connection, operations against these remote machines. So if, let's say, I'm running Tomcat or I'm running IIS or something like that, I want to configure certain things on that machine. I communicate via tentacle to do those operations, and I set that up, and now I have an agent that I can communicate with via Octopus. So this is that connection between Octopus and your deployment target, and then allowing that communication to run. There's a variety of targets, as I mentioned, that we can support out of the box. The difference between a listening tentacle and a polling tentacle: listening tentacle is actively waiting for commands to hit it, whereas a polling will call home, calling Octopus, asking, hey, do you have any work? And so the way you set this up is you just simply set up a new, in this case here, I'm setting up a listening tentacle. I give it the DNS name for the deployment target that I wish to discover. This is a well-defined port for us. Octopus is actually in well-known ports up on Wikipedia, 10933. And then we give it a thumbprint to ensure that the communication is trusted between Tentacle and Octopus. But that's a little bit beyond what we're defining here for Octopus 101. But this is kind of how you establish agents to run, which we call Tentacle, on these remote machines to do work. There's a variety of other things as well that we can touch on, things like defining environments. You can associate, obviously, deployment targets with these environments. So this is where you do those matching of targets with environments. I've got one example here where I'm using a cloud region, but if I jump over here to another example, sorry for the little context switch there. If I jump into here and take a look at some other deployment targets, you can see I have a Kubernetes cluster here defined through the agent itself. I can take a look at the environments of where that target looks or operates. You can see I have it defined here. We actually manage the health of the targets themselves. Again, that's that communication that occurs. We're communicating with Tentacle here to basically say, are you ready to receive work? Are you able to perform work on our behalf? So we monitor that. Now, something I wanted to mention earlier, I mentioned this as part of this instance here, which is a new feature we have called Kubernetes Live Object Status. So you'll see this little switch here at the top. If you're doing any work with Kubernetes, I'll just mention this here because we just shipped this. By enabling this capability, we actually can communicate with our Kubernetes agent and get a sense of what is happening on the remote cluster. So here you can see I have a live status of healthy. My last deployment here was completed 3 days ago. And then I get a breakdown of all the objects that are associated with this cluster. So I can take a look at the service, the endpoints, the pods, for example. I can drill into one of these objects and I can get a sense of its state through a summary. I can also take a look at any events, or if there are any. Here I don't have any. I can take a look at the logs associated with this. And I can also take a look at the manifest associated, in this case, the pod itself. So Live Object Status is a brand new early access capability we've just enabled for integration with Kubernetes. And it exposes itself or makes it surface itself out through the dashboard through this button. It's a really powerful feature. We like it a lot. So if you're doing anything with Kubernetes, definitely worth checking out. It's definitely something that we're really, really proud of. All right, so jumping back to the slides. All right, so that was another demo. I showed you a lot of stuff. Apologies for that. I know this in some cases it can be overwhelming, but I think if you sign up for a free trial and maybe kick the tires yourself, you'll get a sense of what it's all about. All right, so hopefully in this webinar you've learned a few of the following things. You learned a little bit about how Octopus works, and also, and probably most importantly, why you should consider it. Understanding of the why behind the technology is extremely important because that allows you to understand where that fits in your organization, in your pipeline. I talked a lot about fundamentals here. I talked about things like projects, environments, deployment processes, releases. You saw runbooks, for example. You saw Kubernetes live object status. Really, really cool capability. I showed you how to define a deployment process using steps, which are a collection of actions that run as part of a deployment, similar to the way in which a runbook is defined. And then how to trigger those deployments through a variety of integration points, whether that integration point is through Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions or Jenkins or any other number of CI processes and or solutions. Before I wrap up here and take your questions, just wanted to point out a couple of resources that we have available here. One resource that we have available is, of course, our other webinars, which you'll find at octopus.com/webinars. The webinar that you are currently attending is this one. We have other ones that are coming up, including this one here, which is next week featuring Nick and Kit. And they're going to be talking about Kubernetes live object status itself. Let me get rid of my head here so you can see the full description. So Kit and Nick are two members of the team who built this feature, and they're going to be talking about this next week. So make sure to sign up for that. It's going to be a lot of fun talking about Kubernetes live object status. And we also have a show called Argo Unpacked. But if you want to check out any other webinars, you can follow us on this and see the latest things that we'll be talking about. We also have our roadmap. So the roadmap here is really nice because it gives a sense of what's coming. So a lot of customers are very keen to hear what we're planning for future releases. So we utilize a product board for this. You can see all the features we've shipped, not only for cloud, but also calendar-based releases that we have. This is for both cloud and server installations. But we always ship to cloud first because it gives us, there's more control we have on cloud, obviously. So we have new features that are available in cloud, like I can freeze deployments based on a tenant. I can have recurring freezes. For example, let's say there's, there's a time that you don't want to touch production. A classic example might be I'm running a website and my website gets hammered during Christmas and because I'm selling a lot of goods. So I may want to put a deployment freeze on that production instance. And so I can set those things up, and it allows you to prevent deployments from occurring. So these are new features we've added to Octopus. We also have a list of planned features as well. So we have a Terraform provider, for example. We have the ability to scope common tenant variables to environments. We're working on features like ephemeral environments as well. So these and other features we find under the planned section. And you have those ones that are also under considerations. If you have an idea, you can certainly submit them and let us know how important it is for you to have this idea implemented as part of Octopus. So that's up at roadmap.octopus.com. So once again, just to remind you, if you want to kick the tires yourself, you can sign up for a free trial today visiting octopus.com. There you can grab the bits to install on your own infrastructure, or you can set up a cloud instance if you so desire. Definitely something you can check out. We have a ton of resources available for you to check out. We have our docs, we have our YouTube channel. We publish all the time, including we have a show called Deploy on Friday that we publish every week. It's basically like a news show. So make sure to check us out up on YouTube. And with that, let me now jump back into the questions here to see if there are any questions. Again, this is live, so if you have any questions, feel free to submit them to the chat. Happy to answer them here. This is sort of me tap dancing as you're furiously, hopefully, typing. If you have any questions coming up. Just to remind folks, we actually have this recording will be available on YouTube, and it's also being streamed out to all our social media channels as well. So you'll find the recording of this available on those channels as well. What else did I not mention here? Oh, there is something else I want to show. Let me show you this. This is kind of cool. So we actually have also a CLI. So you can actually interface with Octopus via the CLI. No CLI is complete without a really cool ASCII art representation. So you can communicate with Octopus via the CLI. This is something that we've worked on for quite a while. And the reason why this is important is because oftentimes you want to do automation scenarios and utilize a command line interface to do those things. So the CLI here is really powerful, allows you to walk up to it and do a bunch of commands. So when I run Octopus, for example, I can see the commands that are listed here. So I can list things like projects, so take a look at releases, et cetera, et cetera. So if I say Octopus, actually, let me do this so you can see it. Octopus project. Actually, let's make this super big. This may not render very well, but you'll get the sense. So I can say Octopus project list. This is going to go off and say, okay, you have a bunch of spaces. I haven't mentioned what spaces are. If you jump back into Octopus here, a space is like an isolation boundary. It allows you to separate your projects from one another. And it gives you kind of like walled gardens within Octopus. So you can set up these spaces, you can set up permissions around them, and that's essentially what they are. So here I'm actually integrating with one of our demo instances, which you can actually check out yourself. This is the samples instance here. You can see all the spaces that I have here. So this is at samples.octopus.app. You can check it out yourself. These are all the spaces we have set up here. And when I invoke this command to give me a list of projects, it's saying, hey, you need to specify a space first. So let me see what space would you like to use? And so I want to use the blue-green space pattern, which is basically describing a deployment pattern. So it's giving me blue-green. If we take a look at blue-green here, where's blue-green? There we go, blue-green. I'm getting a list of projects here, and you can see these match the list of projects that I have listed here. So I can take a look at those. There's a bunch of other commands that I can run as well, but we have a CLI, and you can definitely use it as part of your automation. So again, that was just me tap dancing or wasting time as you were asking questions. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions listed. All right, so let's go ahead and move to the last slide here. If you have any questions, feel free to reach me on my email alias listed here, john.bristowe@octopus.com. More than happy to answer your questions. I mentioned earlier the YouTube channel. Check it out. We also have our docs page as well. We have a bunch of presence on Reddit. We have presence on all the social media. So feel free to reach out and let us know. We have a very rich community. I should also mention our Slack channel as well. You'll find these listed at octopus.com. Oh, I'm on the wrong tab. Sorry. octopus.com/community, I believe it is. And if you go there, you can join our community Slack. We have over 7,000 members on the Slack. You can ask questions, get in touch with folks like that. So definitely check us out there if you're all inclined. All right, there are no questions, which is either a good thing or a bad thing. So there you go. Anyways, we run these monthly. Thank you for your time and attention. Really appreciate it. We'll see you on the next one. And until next time, happy deployments, everyone. Take care.